Our bodies actually are adapted to be able to eat less often. We have trained them otherwise. Everyone can benefit from 12 hours of not eating. Really and truly, like that should be the gold standard for everyone.
Cynthia, a pleasure to have you on the podcast to talk all things fasting. I want to jump right into the first question, which is, so many people know that fasting is so powerful. They've heard about the science. They know it can do wonders for the body. But my question is, even with all that, why do some people not pursue fasting? Why do they not jump into the deep end and get started?
That's a great question. I think a lot of it's limiting beliefs. We've been so conditioned by society that we need to eat snacks and mini meals that the concept of going longer periods in between eating, it seems a little bit daunting. And I think on a lot of levels, even though there's all this growing awareness and growing bodies of research about metabolic health and strategies such as fasting that can be so critically important for ensuring we have, incredible longevity, I think it really stems from the issues related to kind of a scarcity mindset or this overwhelm. I think it also really reflects the fact that, for many of us, we have a complicated relationship with food, meaning for many people, they eat beyond just I'm hungry. They eat for comfort. And certainly the last 2.5 years, we've all lived through unprecedented amounts of stress. We've been disconnected from loved ones. Maybe, our job roles have changed. Our children, we're evolving, trying to support our children and extended families. And so I also think there's this complex in a relationship with food, and food is not just fuel for many people. Food is a source of comfort. And I do believe fervently that a lot of people have made it through the last 2.5 years by, working on their feelings. And in many ways, they've created opportunities where they've been eating throughout the day and eating hyperpalatable, highly processed foods. And so I would imagine that those are two large contributors. And just, the analysis paralysis. There are also people who are well-intentioned and have a desire to lean into eating less often, and they just get stuck in overthinking things. And fasting doesn't have to be complicated, but many, many people make it more complicated than it needs to be because of this, again, the social conditioning of overthinking everything. And I think for every person who finds really high quality research, there'll be some cruddy research that's out there that completely contradicts the message that someone else is trying to share. And so I do find on a daily basis trying to defend the position of fasting. But I think those are definitely three contributors to why people may not have yet embraced that strategy or really, ingrained it into their day-to-day or week-to-week schedules.
As a champion of fasting, when you sit down, and I know you're not in clinical practice at the moment right now, but really, I would argue that you kind of are in clinical practice. You're like getting people excited. It just is on the web and other things. It's not one-on-one patient. But when you're sitting with someone, even at a cocktail party or somewhere, dinner, and you're really sharing the elevator pitch around fasting and why you fast, what are some of the highlights of some of the things that you're mentioning to them?
Oh, I always talk about, especially at the stage of life that I'm in, having more energy, having a lot of energy, because your body's not focused on breaking down and assimilating food and nutrients. I think about cognition. I mean, gosh, who doesn't want to feel more mentally sharp, irrespective of what life stage you're in? And then also thinking, when we really understand the research between autophagy, which is this waste and recycling process that gets upregulated when we're in an unfed state and lessens our likelihood of developing certain types of chronic diseases that we think of as being completely natural. How many of us believe that high blood pressure and diabetes are just part of the aging process or significant weight gain? And then beyond that, when I'm doing the elevator pitch, I talk about the fact that, I feel much younger than I am chronologically. And I do credit a great deal of that to being able to maintain a very healthy, lean body habitus. And, the changes to body composition related to intermittent fasting are undeniable. But I would say that the changes in energy, the mental clarity are two of the big selling points from my perspective, because how many people assume it's normal to get to be 35, 40, 45, 50 or beyond, and you're tired all the time and you're weight loss resistant and you're feeling really inflamed, chronic joint pain. or any of these other chronic health issues that seem to be the mainstay for most people that are at the life stage I'm in. So that's usually what I choose to focus on. And I find that, those three key areas for a lot of people make it even more intriguing. They're like, oh, I hadn't thought about that.
What's interesting is that you used energy was one of the first things you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
And as I look out in society today and questions that come into the podcast that people want to have our guests cover, like yourself, people are often looking for what is this external thing that will give me energy? They don't necessarily think of energy as being attributed to not having something potentially like fasting. So help people understand that of how does that make sense that how could not having food or eating less, and we'll break down all the details of the type of fasting that you talk about and how to do it, but how could not have something actually be a contributor to giving your body energy?
Such a good question. When we think about what drives energy in the body, we're really talking about organelles, mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of our cells. And by the age of 40, most of us have some degree of dysfunctional mitochondria, which contributes to the fatigue and chronic health issues that we see. But when I explain to people that most of us, if we're eating snacks and mini meals, we're not able to effectively utilize different types of fuel substrates. So our body isn't able to effectively use both glucose and fatty acids and potentially ketones, versus when we eat less often, it forces our body to use fuel much more efficiently. So our body can use, if we're being chased by a rabid animal, can use glucose as a fuel substrate, but it can also tap into stored fat. And even thin people have plenty of stored fat, which can be broken down into fatty acids and certain types of ketones, in particular beta hydroxybutyrate, which actually diffuses across the blood-brain barrier in an unfed state, can provide a really effective energy source for brain cells. So when we understand that we want our bodies to be metabolically flexible, because this can help improve energy, is really understanding that metabolic flexibility is highly dependent on meal frequency and being able to effectively utilize stored fat as a fuel source. And so understanding that fats and ketones in particular really potentiate this energy source. This is why people can work out in an unfed state when they're fat adapted. People have the ability to be very cognitively astute going through their day in an unfed state until they choose to break their fast. And so on a very, very simple level, it's understanding that metabolic flexibility is what provides that additional energy, and people feeling like they're much more energetic. When people say to me, I feel like I have more energy at 50 than I did at 35. And I always say that's the beauty of metabolic flexibility.
Metabolic flexibility is something that our audience has gotten a chance to get to know more about that phrase over the last few years. My business partner, Dr. Mark Hyman, he wrote a book, many years ago called The Blood Sugar Solution. And inside of that, he, didn't use that phrase, but he's talking about what it looks like to get your body in that state. But that phrase specifically, metabolic flexibility, thanks to people like Dr. Casey Means, people like yourself, Ben Bickman, individuals that we've had on the podcast, people are becoming a lot more aware. But still, I would say, just kind of like with fasting, there might be some people that are listening that don't fully understand what that looks like. So let's use a contrast. What are some top signs that you could share? Symptoms, reactions, other stuff, habits in people's lives that are a good indication that they're not metabolically flexible? Are there things that they're doing or feeling throughout the day that shows that they may not have metabolic flexibility? And by the way, metabolic flexibility is a good thing. So you're going to share with us the signs that maybe somebody is not in that place right now.
Absolutely. I would think first and foremost, when you eat a meal and you get hungry 1 to 2 hours later, that's a sign that you're either not fueling your body effectively or you're not particularly fuel efficient. I also think about the people that get hangry. So they're hungry, but they're getting grumpy, kind of like a toddler. I could also make the argument kind of like a teenager, because I have a few of those in my house as well. But those hangry episodes are a sign that your body is not effectively utilizing fats as a stored form of fuel. People that have stubborn weight loss resistance because their body is not metabolically well adapted. The people that say to me, I'm doing all the right things and I can't lose weight, more often than not, it's because their body is stuck, whether it's leptin or insulin resistance. And I'm sure we'll probably touch on some of these things. That can be a major contributor. I also think about, people that can't go more than 2 to 3 hours in between a meal. And it's because they're utilizing that fast, quick source of glucose or carbohydrates for fuel, and they're not able to tap into the fats. And so those are some of the key, most common things that I see. But it's also that fatigue. If you eat a meal and you're really tired after eating, that's not normal. That is a sign that either you didn't put your macros, your protein, fat, and carbohydrates together, but could also be a sign of not being metabolically flexible. And unfortunately, I think in our society, we think it's normal to get tired after eating a meal or to feel like we've eaten a good sized meal and we want to continue eating. It's almost like those satiation cues are off, which is super common to see some degree of leptin resistance. But if you keep wanting to eat after eating a good sized meal, that can also be a sign that you're not in a position where you're metabolically optimized.
And having your training and background as a nurse practitioner, can you share with us, just for the people that are following along, what might be some biomarkers that are also an indication where you can see it in your blood work that you haven't stepped into metabolic flexibility?
I would say first and foremost, a fasting insulin. I think it's the first biomarker that becomes dysregulated in some degree of insulin resistance way before fasting glucose or an A1C. And they do have their place. But I think if we were looking at more fasting insulins, we would be discovering more people who are heading in the wrong direction. I also think about triglycerides and HDL. We know that part of this metabolic syndrome are triglycerides that are greater than 150, HDL if you're a male, less than 45, women if they're less than 55. And what's interesting is every time I would work, and my whole background as an NP is in cardiology, so 16 years working with some very sick patients, and I would look at a triglyceride and it was 500, 300. And I would say, you have a carbohydrate problem. And they would say, no. And I would say, generally the people that have got genetic propensities for high triglycerides, it's exceedingly high, and that puts them at risk for pancreatitis. But that was definitely a barometer which I would use. I would say, okay, we need to clean up the carbohydrates because you're not getting this from eating too much meat. You're not getting this from eating too many vegetables. This is clearly processed carbohydrates, alcohol, etc. Those are three that I think about. I think about high sensitivity CRP. I certainly lean into some of the other biophysical markers. We're looking at fasting glucose, certainly uric acid. I know that Dr. David Perlmutter has really kind of highlighted this area in particular as being a metabolic health marker. How many people have gout? Or my patients in Baltimore used to call it gouch, which I thought was so cute, that really have these issues related to too high uric acid levels. And we're not talking to our patients about the fact that this is a sign that your insulin is way too high. I also think about just having, a blood pressure that's not within a proper range is a sign of some degree of insulin resistance. Those are the ones I tend to focus in on. I mean, obviously you can get with some degree of insulin resistance, you can get changes in your sex hormones. There are other things that go on, but fasting insulin is one that I talk about all the time because it is such an inexpensive test. And far too many allopathic trained providers are not looking at this measure. And I think it's criminal because if we really want to get ahead of metabolic health issues, we have to start doing a better job of monitoring and prevention as opposed to waiting until someone has, documented disease, waiting until they actually have a chronic health issue. Let's be much more preventative. So those are the ones that I typically focus in on.
And because you really highlighted fasting insulin as the first one, do you have a range where when somebody, first of all, it's kind of sad, but a lot of people you have to kind of maybe fight a little bit. And I don't mean that in advocate, I guess is the better word, because not always, unless if there's something immediately where you are screened or have a history of diabetes in your family, or you are clearly sort of diabetic or pre-diabetic, you kind of have to push your practitioner to order this lab for you. As you mentioned, it's not expensive, but when people do convince or work with one of these direct lab companies, which it's great that there's more of them that are out there, and let's say that they get their number back, what general range are you thinking about when it comes to fasting and insulin as they start to work towards more optimal numbers?
Yeah, I do like to see it between 2 and 5. And more often than not, a women will come to me and they'll say, I've been weight loss resistant for a period of time. I don't understand why this is happening. And all their other values don't look too bad, labs that they've done through their healthcare professional. And then I'll say, well, let's do a fasting insulin. And their fasting insulin's 20. And I'm like, well, now we understand. And so now we need to work very, very diligently or a fasting insulin of 15 or a fasting insulin of 12. And I just say it gives us something to work towards objectively. And I really congratulate the healthcare practitioners who are now starting to order this test in particular, because we could be monitoring patients for years way ahead and, saying to them, okay, your fasting insulin's been 5 for 5 years and now it's 10. We need to do something differently so that we can lower this, understanding that it is oftentimes a biomarker. And I've had conversations with a lot of physicians who believe it's 5 to 10 years preceding becoming, officially insulin resistant or diabetic. And, given the lack of metabolic flexibility in our general population, this should be something that is monitored several times a year, monitored with, lifestyle changes, et cetera. But I really think that this is an inexpensive way to get a sense. It's like a litmus test, really, to get a sense of where someone is. How much work do we need to do? Do we have to be aggressive? Or can we say, okay, it's a little bit of tweaking, maybe a little bit of fasting, lower carbohydrate. Let's take a walk after dinner or your big meals. Let's focus on sleep. All things that are so important, but yet we're not consistently talking about these things enough. I think, the traditional kind of allopathic model, which I was trained in, many people, they're bucking up against so many changes in the healthcare system that they just don't feel like they have time to do one more thing. It feels onerous and overwhelming.
So it's such a profound thing of what you just shared. So I just want to make sure that our audience has those dots connected. So just, can you firmly connect the dots between, if you have an elevated fasting insulin, right, out of that range that you mentioned, and many people are way out of that range that you mentioned, they're in their 15, 20 and above. How does that make it difficult to lose weight?
So when your fasting insulin levels are high, your body cannot go in and draw upon fats as a fuel source. So it's almost like there's a lock and key mechanism that has been disrupted. So when as an example, we're in a fasted state and our insulin levels are low, our body can go in and can draw upon those fatty acids and utilize them as a fuel substrate. But if your fasting insulin is high, either because you eat constantly, and let's be frank, we've been telling our patients for years, eat 3 meals a day and snacks, and, eat to stoke your metabolism, and, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. What we're forgetting is that every time we're eating, depending on what we're eating, we can get either a significant blood sugar rise or maybe a minimal one. And important to probably note here that we're going to get a much greater response from blood sugar and insulin secreted to bring that blood sugar back down. If you're eating all carbohydrates, it's very different than eating some protein and healthy fats, which are going to have a more negligible impact on that blood sugar response. So understanding that meal frequency, chronic stress, understanding that if you're getting poor quality sleep, all of these things can mitigate that. But the big takeaway is, if your fasting insulin's high, guess what? You are not going to be metabolically flexible. It is hormonally you are hormonally incapable of drawing upon those stored fats as a fuel source. And really important to understand that there are ways we can work around this. There's never been a patient that I've worked with who's had a high insulin that we haven't been able to fix. But more often than not, that knowledge is power. But it's understanding on a fundamental level, fasting insulin needs to be low to be able to utilize it effectively. It's not a bad hormone. It gets a bad rap, unfortunately. We think about insulin resistance and that's all we always say. It's a negative thing. And I always say insulin is a beautiful hormone when it's properly balanced. And all these hormones, it's almost like there's a great symphony. We need to properly balance these hormones. And much of that can be adjusted by simply changing our lifestyle.
Yeah, it's so important to remember these things that we feel like we want to demonize play a super important role in the body, even things like plaque, right? And obviously we know the cholesterol story and we've talked about that. What was really interesting, and I know you're familiar with his work and he's been on this podcast before, but Ben Bickman was saying that there are 2 times in our life where our body actually goes into insulin resistance to support us. One of them is, and you mentioned you have teenagers in the house, one is during puberty. Insulin is a major part of helping us rapidly grow, in the case of women, to develop, breast and their hips and everything else. For young men, also just growing rapidly, being a part of that process, that sort of insatiable appetite, which is part of that process of stepping into it. And then the other one, which if I understand correctly, was also when is it when it's a baby? a baby is going through it, or is it when a mother's pregnant? Either way, I'll look back up and I'll write that inside of the show notes. Maybe you know. Do you know the other time that the body actually purposely goes into insulin resistance?
Well, I think it's a very delicate balance, during pregnancy, because you don't want insulin resistance that's then fueling gestational diabetes.
Totally.
But I being the parent of teenagers, especially male teenagers, I can assure you that anabolic massive growth phase, the amount of food that their bodies can intake in a meal, let alone over the course of 24 hours, is quite impressive.
So let's zoom back out to fasting, because really the other dots that we're connecting through your work and that you've highlighted in your book, it's there in the background for the people that are watching: Intermittent Fasting Transformation, the 45-day program for women to lose stubborn weight, improve hormonal health, and slow aging. So to connect the dots with fasting and metabolic health and improving metabolic flexibility, fasting is one of the primary levers that you've used both as a practitioner and now in your teaching to help people step into optimal metabolic health. So how do you look at the world of fasting? Fasting can mean a lot of different things. And is there a particular type of fasting that you recommend for most people?
Yeah. I mean, fasting is as simple as saying eat less often. I think it's very triggering for some people to say the word fasting can be very triggering. And so I always say that the beauty of fasting is it's flexible. We don't have to do the same eating and feeding window and fasting window on a daily basis. I do lean into a 16-8 as a good starting point. Obviously, there are lots of variations, but I do find that the average person, when they're new to fasting and we're working our way up to 16 hours fasted with an 8-hour feeding window, is a good starting point. Obviously, there are people that engage and advocate for longer fasts. People are doing shorter fasts. But for the average person that's listening, that's trying to, wrap their heads around, I'm going to go 16 hours without eating, it's understanding most of that time is spent sleeping. That's the one thing for many people. They don't realize you're actually sleeping, 8, 9, 10 hours a day, or you've stopped eating and you're heading to bed. And it really isn't as arduous as people anticipate it will be. I know that even myself, I had a healthy amount of skepticism at first. And then I started doing it. So really it's eating less often and understanding that feeding and that fasting window are very flexible. So obviously men and menopausal women can fast differently than women that are still getting a menstrual cycle. And that's an area of my work because it hasn't really been focused in on very much in most others' work. But I think that fasting is really as simple as eating less often. And it's not new or novel. That's unfortunately one of those things that the media really wants us to believe, that it's new and novel and it's just like, a fad and a phase. And I have to remind them that this dates back to biblical times. All the major religions have incorporated some degree of fasting into their practices. And so it is not new. It may be new to us because we've been conditioned otherwise by, I want to believe, well-meaning clinicians and probably the media. But our bodies actually are adapted to be able to eat less often. We have trained them otherwise, though.
When people hear it, they're often facing against all the marketing advice that they see out there in the world. You hinted at that a little bit earlier, but I think it's just worthwhile touching on for a second. Why are the powers that be, and I don't mean that in a conspiratorial way, I think economics is often the primary driver of things, but why is the powers that be, and how did we get so entrenched in this idea that we have to eat regularly and somehow that will help us have a better metabolism or will help us keep up our metabolism?
Yeah. Well, the processed food industry is ultimately there to make a profit. And so if you look at the trajectory of the processed food industry over the last 100 years, last 80 years, we went from, as a society, largely eating a substantive breakfast, whether it's bacon and eggs, whether it's leftover steak, whatever it is that we're eating, because people actually needed to have a real hearty breakfast because they weren't going to eat again till lunch, or maybe they didn't eat again till later in the afternoon or evening. And we slowly transitioned to eating a lot of grain products. Obviously, things that are subsidized by the federal government really proliferate in the processed food industry, and grains are a large part of that. And we went from eating, protein and healthy fats to eating a lot of carbohydrate. And so whether it's cereal or granola or sugar sweetened beverages or, the sugar sweetened yogurt that's out there, we've shifted away from being protein focused to being carbohydrate focused. And we went from having a substantive meal and not being hungry for 4 or 5 hours to eating a poultry meal with not a lot of nutritional value, that is not going to keep our blood sugar stable, that is going to, create a degree of potential insulin resistance, and is not going to give us the cognitive ability to be able to focus for hours on end. We're going to get hungry an hour or two later. And this is where I think the notion started, was we started changing the way we were eating. We started eating much more processed foods. And it's interesting. My grandparents, my grandfather was Italian, my grandmother was German. And they used to talk to me quite a bit, because food is very important in Italians' lifestyles. And so they would talk to me about what they were watching, from an evolution perspective over the past 50 plus years. And they used to talk about, like, people used to grow gardens, and people used to, spend a lot of time making meals. And I think the processed food industry stepped in after World War II and really started to convince people, like, oh, if you buy these products, they're going to help you stay out of the kitchen. You're not going to have to spend as much time. People started getting disconnected from the process of cooking. People started feeling dependent on these processed foods to be able to create quote unquote nutritious meals for their families. So I think there's many things that changed that contributed to this. But when I think about the processed food industry as a whole, they've introduced products to make our lives easier. But in essence, these same products have made us less healthy. So we're convinced we don't know how to cook. We're convinced that meals should be prepared in 5 minutes. We've convinced ourselves that we should eat on the go, all these convenience foods. Think about it when you travel, go to an airport, there's very rarely, at least where I seem to go through, there aren't always healthy options while you're traveling. And so when I think about all the things that have contributed to this mindset that we've gotten disconnected from the way our bodies are designed to, fervently thrive. And instead we are focused on quick fixes, believing that, the limiting beliefs that we don't need to be cooking, or that these things are going to be healthier than what we could create in our own home. And we're kind of heading down a path where young people don't know how to cook, and they're convinced that they want to go through the fast food line because that's going to be more convenient. But more often than not, the processed foods that they're consuming are contributing to insulin resistance and poor metabolic health. I posted something on social media the other day about Chick-fil-A. And it was showing what the ingredients were in the bun and the chicken and the seasonings. And most of it was seed oils, and a lot of, hydrogenated products that no one should be eating. And people are understanding now that oftentimes when you're consuming these hyper palatable foods, you want more and more and more, because it dysregulates these key, hormonal mechanisms in the body that remind us we're full, as opposed to sitting down and having a steak, and maybe you have some broccoli, and then maybe you're having something else with your meal, and you feel full and satiated because your body can recognize what those macronutrients are. So I think many things have contributed to this. Certainly I always say that if you start your day with, processed carbs, you're definitely not setting yourself up in the right foot or the right frame of mind to be able to get through your day and have enough energy, and feel like you're going to be able to tackle whatever the day throws at you.
What I love about your message and how you break things down is, number one, you're a great storyteller, and I just want to acknowledge you for that. You really help people kind of connect the dots and see what was happening in the past versus now. Another thing that you do that I think is very needed in today's world of health and wellness is that you hear a few different things when it comes to this topic of, you were just chatting about breakfast, right? So on one side, let's call it the traditional TV advertising, the old model. It's like breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And within that context, it's, you need to have your cereal, you need to have your donut, bagel, whatever. They just looking at it from a standpoint of calories in, calories out, get that external energy that's there, right? Then you have another side of, let's call it, some of the health trends that we've been seeing where people are like, skip breakfast. It's completely unnecessary. Just fast and go right into whatever you need to do for the day. And, there's no reason to have that component, which, okay, there might be a lot of individuality, and sometimes that works great for individuals, especially when they've tapped into metabolic flexibility. But this other area that you kind of highlight in the middle, which is that it's not that breakfast is bad or good. The question is, what are you fueling yourself with, and how does that set the tone for what's going on, especially when you're in this transitionary phase of getting your body from not metabolically flexible to more metabolically flexible. So that often means, do Did you have a really tough workout the day before? Do you have a lot of cognitive activities? There's a lot of layers that you're balancing out. We don't want to just rule things out completely. Well, we know that traditional story that we see on TV, that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, so just eat as much as sugar and carbs as you want. We know that that's not true because we could just look around and see that it's not working. But there's these other sides where people can have a little bit of variation. So help us unpack that variation. And is there any variation specifically on the topic of breakfast that you teach your clients and that your coaches teach the people that they're working with?
It's such a good way to think about this. And I'm going to disclose this to you up front. So today is one of those very busy days. I had a very heavy leg day yesterday. I woke up this morning and I was hungry. My day is so busy that I knew I was not going to have an opportunity to eat in between all the things that I'm doing. And so I got up this morning and I ate breakfast. And I think most people would be surprised to know that. But I think that when you get to a point, when you acknowledge where you are in time and space, when you look at your schedule and you say to yourself, I would rather sit down and have a real nutrient dense whole foods diet meal than fast really long today. Because I can tell you right now, like when I'm that hungry when I wake up, I know it's that my body's looking for me personally, I need to eat. I'm going to get that protein bolus in, and then I will make it through all of my things I need to do on my calendar. But when I'm working with women in particular, if I'm working with my coaches, I always tell them, first of all, our bodies, if we lean into our intuitive side of our bodies, and for many people, if you're not metabolically healthy, that's challenging. So let me just preface that. But when you're in a point where you are metabolically flexible, I think those cues, sometimes you don't sleep well. Sometimes you had a really tough workout. Maybe you're stressed. Maybe you didn't eat enough the day before because you just had a busy day. And that does happen. It really genuinely happens. Not to my teenagers, but it does happen to me on occasion. That might be a day where you're not going to fast as long. You may get up in the morning and say, I've done a 15-hour fast already. I'm ready to eat. And you need to intuitively lean into what your body is trying to share with you. I think on the other end, we have to acknowledge that we as women, if we're still getting menstrual cycles, there are going to be times during our cycles when we're going to have greater success with fasting than in others. I think it's important to acknowledge that if you're not sleeping, that's not a time to fast. And I'm sure you probably have had other guests on that have talked about hormesis and hormetic stress and how this is so important, beneficial stress in the right amount at the right time. Intermittent fasting is a type of hormesis. And so it might be you have too much on your plate, and that is okay. So what I always say is a gold standard for everyone, unless you are growing, like you are a teenager, like my teenagers don't fast. Pregnant people, breastfeeding people should not fast. But one thing I like to emphasize is that everyone can benefit from 12 hours of not eating. Really and truly, like that should be the gold standard for everyone. And I don't consider that per se fasting, but that's 12 hours of digestive rest, which has incredible health benefits. And that should be the gold standard that we're teaching our patients and we're talking to people about. So when I talk about fasting and really leaning into bioindividuality, it's asking yourself all of those questions: sleep, stress, life circumstances, where you are in your menstrual cycle, where you are in life stage, and understanding it is okay to adjust. We don't have to be rigid. That's one thing about fasting that I always like to emphasize is how important it is to not be rigid. One of the key proponents of fasting from my perspective is flexibility. So you may fast 5 days out of the week and say on the weekends, I don't want to fast, and that's okay. Or you may fast 2 weeks out of your menstrual cycle and say, I don't want to fast the last 2 weeks of my menstrual cycle. Or a male could say, I don't want to fast on the days I'm lifting really heavy. And that's okay. But I think the gold standard should really be, can you get enough protein into your feeding window? Where are you life stage? And what is your lifestyle like at that given point in time? All of those things can really impact the success that you embrace with fasting.
So I'd love your thoughts on this. And it's fasting related to time of day, which also plays into this breakfast topic that we were talking about. So the culture that I come from, the Vedic culture, the sort of Hindu culture in India, I saw my grandparents fasting, my entire life growing up. I saw my parents fasting on a regular basis. And one of the things that I noticed for them is that fasting was often something that there would be times where spiritually or religiously they were doing a whole day fast, right? That would be in there too. Like they'd be doing a water fast. But the other times where there was a version of like your 16 hours that you were recommending earlier, they would tend to skip dinner and they would hold off on dinner and focus on sort of breakfast and lunch. And when I would ask, a little bit about it more recently, asking my dad, he's like, well, it was probably just a little bit of a layover of the fact that the region that I'm from in India, probably traditionally we were farmers and people were working during the day and like very busy, or people were working in the office and kind of needed cognitive performance. So it was easier to eat in the morning and have the energy to be able to focus and do things like that, and then skip dinner. Now, dinner in the Western world is very social and we spend time with our families, we spend time with our friends. So it's a little bit tougher to do that. So would love your take on that. When you're recommending to people and they're trying to make this individual for themselves, do you ever recommend that people, skip another meal instead of if they're thinking about potentially skipping breakfast as part of their fasting routine?
Yeah. And I want to just highlight that breaking your fast can really be at any time during the day. I think we think of breakfast as a morning thing, but breaking our fast could really occur at any time during the day. But if you lean into the chronobiology research that's out there, we know that we're more insulin sensitive during the day. And I always say we're heading into daylight savings. And so eat when it's light outside, don't eat when it's dark outside. And so really kind of leaning into understanding that, breaking your fast 10, 11 o'clock is probably not a bad idea, and getting your last meal in before it is dark time, understanding also that you're more insulin sensitive during the day than you are in the evening. And that may seem counterintuitive, or that may not seem like that's necessarily attainable, because I recognize when I was doing long hours in the hospital, that would have been nearly impossible to eat, let alone eat twice during a time when I was at work. But I think it's understanding that for each one of us, we're all individuals and we have to figure out what makes you feel good. For me, I do much better eating earlier in the day and closing my feeding window by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Now, I always sit with my family when they eat dinner, and on the weekends, we all eat together. But during the week, when I'm doing a lot of carpool and other things, I sometimes will just close my feeding window before my family eats, and that's what works for me. But when we're really looking at lifestyles and people's occupations and what's realistic for them, I think we really have to take a lot of different variables into account. And one of them may very well be that eating a little earlier in the day is more aligned with the way our bodies are designed to be optimized. Understanding that, as our bodies are exposed to sunlight, we're suppressing melatonin, we're increasing cortisol to kind of tell our bodies that it's time to get moving. And understanding that much the same as we're heading into when it gets dark outside. And if we're eating too close to bedtime, we have clocks, with these melatonin clocks. They're not just in the pineal gland in the brain. They're also throughout the digestive system. If we eat too close to bed, it's going to suppress melatonin, which is one of those hormones that helps us. It's a master antioxidant, but one of those hormones that helps us process, okay, it's time to go to bed. There's certain things that go on, but you'll actually increase your cortisol because your body's trying to process this bolus of food. And just understanding that if you really lean into the chronobiology research, fasting can absolutely be optimized working along with that, but also understanding that there's so many other variables that can impact your success. And so a degree of experimentation, which is something I think a lot of providers don't talk to our patients about. We usually say there's a one size fits all, and that's how most of us are, this is how it's supposed to be. But I'm here to encourage people to really experiment a little bit. And for many people, that makes them feel a little uncomfortable. They're like, wait a minute, I want to be told what to do. And I typically will say, try a couple different strategies out. Try breaking your fast at 10, try baking at 12, try baking at 2. See how you feel trying to get those 2 meals in before you go to sleep. And then, lean into what works best for you.
I heard you say recently on another podcast that you sort of feel best when you eat dinner by about 6 p.m. Is that true? Is that still the case right now?
That is very much the case. And in fact, I get made fun of by my extended family because they say, you're kind of like acting like the grandparents. And I said, no, actually, the one benefit for me of the pandemic was, because I had so much time at home, was understanding my body actually feels really good when I close my feeding window earlier. And so I can back that up with looking at, I typically wear a continuous glucose monitor, and I was like looking at the data. My blood sugars are better. I sleep better. My Oura ring is not squawking at me. And so it's just understanding that for my particular body, I do better having, closing that feeding window a whole lot earlier than I used to. I was the person, socially or out with friends or parties or events, and you're eating until 7, 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And I'm like, why was my sleep so messed up? Why did I have such a terrible night of sleep? Or why is my blood sugar higher than it normally is? And understanding that that's definitely a factor that played a role in that decision. And my family, to their credit, with the exception of the weekends, we try to eat by 7 o'clock. It's definitely one of those things where they've been very supportive, which has certainly helped.
Yeah, it's nice when you can do it with somebody. And I think for anybody who's listening, as you age and you enter into different brackets and time stages of your life, one thing that pretty much everybody notices, even if you're healthy, even if you work out, even if you prioritize sleep, is that some of the same things you did back in your 20s and 30s and 40s, you do them now at a different stage in life. And they just have a little bit bigger of a toll. One of those could be alcohol, which, I'd love to talk to you about in a little bit. We'll come back to that topic. We'll put a little button into that. But for me, I turned 40 this year, and I just have noticed that even with working out, even with getting my morning sunlight, even with all the beautiful things that I incorporate into my lifestyle and diet and other things, if my sleep can more easily get thrown off if I am doing things that potentially could throw it off. Now, these things just a few years ago didn't throw it off, like multiple late night dinners in a row. Like there's nothing more enjoyable than eating with a group of friends. A bunch of my friends in LA have some incredible restaurants. And, typically for everybody's schedule, we're going there and we're meeting at like 7:30, which means that we're not done until 10 o'clock. That's so fun. I have so much fun doing it. And I don't want to do that 3 nights in a row. And if I do, I notice my sleep is trashed and I just don't feel good the next day. So I think that's an important thing for people to hear, is that you can enjoy it, you can indulge, you can have these little moments here and there. But if you start to notice it impacts the foundation of how you show up on a day-to-day basis, that's when we need to start thinking out of the box and try something new.
I couldn't agree with you more. And the irony is, I had a big birthday last year, so I'm 51. And I was telling someone the other day, I've been taking more things out of my diet in the past 10 years than I ever did before. And, I don't look at it as, I don't want anyone to feel sympathy or anything. But as I've pulled things out of my diet, I've just felt so good. It's not worth it. Like the cost benefit, when I look at it, I'm like, if I eat the gluten or eat the dairy, I know I'm not going to feel good. So I choose not to consume those things. And I have a lot of variety in my diet otherwise. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's really leaning into what makes my body feel good and what doesn't, what doesn't derail me from being able to live my otherwise healthy lifestyle. I stopped drinking during the pandemic. I never had a problem. I've never been a big drinker. But for me, alcohol was such an easy thing to remove because it impacted my sleep. And my sleep is so important that it wasn't worth it. So now sometimes I go out and I'll ask for a martini glass with water in it and I want the olives. So I'm like, I really think all those years of having, 1 or 2 martinis was more about the socialization piece and the access to salt.
I had a mentor a few years ago that shared this phrase, and he said that how strict you are in your life has a lot to do with how sick you are. And that was just kind of his shortened phrase. Obviously, sick can mean a lot of different things, but I'd love to ask you in your story, what fasting and keeping an optimal routine has meant to you, especially with your diagnosis with an autoimmune condition. So give us a little bit about your background and your health journey and how that diagnosis plays into your discovery of leaning into all these health practices, including stepping into fasting.
It's a great question. And it's interesting because I didn't start connecting the dots until I was in my 40s. So when I was in my 20s, I was treated appropriately for Lyme and, 6 weeks of antibiotics. I'm grateful that the doctor I was working with was on top of it. I was treated appropriately. But 6 months later, I developed psoriasis. And my psoriasis, to be very clear, was always very mild. I did not have very severe psoriasis, but enough that I required steroids and saw my dermatologist regularly. And I happened to start working with a functional medicine doctor. And the first thing she said to me was, well, you realize you have psoriasis because you developed leaky gut because you were treated with antibiotics. And I was like, whoa, wait a minute. This is like totally new to me. And she said, and because you've had one autoimmune issue, you're likely to have others. And so I then developed a second autoimmune issue after my pregnancies. And still, even then, I wasn't putting two and two together. And then lastly, in my early 40s, I developed Hashimoto's, which is, so I've had three autoimmune issues. Not, again, because I'm traditionally allopathic trained. I'm not dense, but it was like, it took me developing a third to go, oh, now I finally understand. We think of autoimmunity and, I was like, that's sick people. That's not me. That isn't me. And so I then took things very seriously and I reversed everything with going gluten-free. That was number one. So going gluten-free was, pretty significant. Probably a year or two later, I started fasting. And I remember my dermatologist saying to me, I would never believe it had you not been my patient. But she said, all of this changed with going gluten-free. And I said, yes, off all medications. I do take thyroid medicine still to this day, but I'm off all of my other medications for the autoimmune conditions that I have. And I think on a lot of levels, because I was gluten-free, because I have been fasting, because I really leaned into the lifestyle piece, I've kept all of those things very quiet. I don't have any markers that suggest I have any active disease. But I think on a lot of levels, for many people, they think about fasting in terms of body composition changes, weight loss. And yet we understand on a deep physiological level that eating less frequently allows our body to be optimized. And so I always like to think about the gut health and the strength of Paneth cells and things that go on in the gut, optimization of the migrating motor complex and all of these things that we don't even think about. I used to say to my patients, I think my patients think about food when they chew it and swallow it and when they defecate. And in between, they think that everything works optimally. And I'm here to tell you that sometimes we have to do things that can help support our bodies in more, substantial ways. And so I do credit intermittent fasting for helping to keep my autoimmune conditions very quiet and non-detectable. And I also think the dietary changes certainly have helped substantially. And I think for a lot of people, they don't make the connection that our nutritional choices can absolutely impact our overall health. They can absolutely impact our gut health and make us more susceptible to autoimmune issues. And I don't feel like there's enough focus on that. I think those putting those pieces together usually means either functional or integrative medicine will start putting those pieces together, and then there's a trickle down. But it can take so long, as I know, that even the research takes 10 to 20 years to trickle down into the average clinician's toolbox. So, for me, I love to speak very openly about this so that other people understand. First of all, if you have a thyroid issue, more than likely it is Hashimoto's. Almost all of the hypothyroidism that we diagnose is related to an autoimmune issue. It's a very small subset of the population that might be attributable to something else. But more often than not,
90% is women for Hashimoto's as well.
Correct.
So even more of a
Correct.
reason for women to pay attention to that.
Yeah. And I think there's a whole epidemic of subclinical hypothyroidism, women who are suffering needlessly because the kind of conventional prevailing perspectives are it has to be these two labs that are abnormal. And if anything else is abnormal, then you don't have hypothyroidism. Because I look at labs so frequently still, because I work in conjunction with other healthcare professionals. And I'll say to the patient, you've got Hashimoto's. Oh, no, I don't. My doctor said I don't. I'm like, well, I'm going to explain to you why you have Hashimoto's, and why we're more susceptible heading into perimenopause at the 10 to 15 years preceding menopause, and even more so in menopause.
Well, what's fascinating, and, you kind of touched on it, but I'd love to expand on it a little bit, is that there's so much research around and awareness. And when I say research, sometimes that's, research in a research setting, studies, scientific papers, but also there's this whole category of clinical experience, which is also part of the research process. Somebody's clinical experience, people putting together case studies, a lot of the work that the Institute of Functional Medicine and many of the practitioners do there, that is a big part of this. So there's a lot of people that have noticed that fasting was part of the way that they healed their gut. Can you talk a little bit more about that in your condition? Like, what was actually going on when you were stepping into fasting? And of course, you were optimizing sleep, you were cleaning up your diet, but how is it that fasting plays a role in helping us to clean up our gut health and maybe patch up a little bit of leaky gut?
Yeah, well, it's in these periods of time when we are not eating that we can optimize the gut microbiome, not just the beneficial but non-beneficial bacteria that are there. I think about the fact that as women, and I'll focus on women about this specifically, that estrogen and progesterone and testosterone have far reaching impact throughout the body, but estrogen in particular can be very helpful for insulin sensitivity, for understanding that when we're in this unfed state, it's so important to be allowing for this digestive rest process. And when I think about the optimization of the key hormones and thinking about a reduction of inflammation, I mean, how many people have reached out and have said, oh, I was told I had rheumatoid arthritis or osteoarthritis, and now I have no pain in my joints simply by eating less often. So a reduction in inflammation, less oxidative stress, understanding that we're optimizing the mitochondria, that we're giving our body an opportunity to get rid of disease disordered cells that have the potential to go on and either create disease or potentially become precancerous. So there's a lot that goes on that I think on a lot of different levels, that a more substantive understanding of fasting, you fast long enough, you can impact stem cell regeneration. You can impact telomere length. So telomeres are a marker of aging. I know a lot of people want to fast for a really long time because they're like, more is better. And I have to remind them that more is not more. Sometimes, less is more. But understand that there's different things that can go on in the gut microbiome and the microbiota that can be significantly enhanced, potentially potentiated by eating less frequently. And certainly the duration of fasting can impact that on different levels.
Let's continue on this thread of women in particular. Talk to us about the different life stages. So if somebody is in their 20s, you already talked about, teens don't need to be fasting, right? They just need to focus on showing up, especially getting good sleep and trying to eat as clean of a diet as they can. But again, they're teenagers, and so their body can get away with a lot more. But, and parents are doing their best, but it's always a tricky time. But talk about somebody that's in their early 20s or 30s, right? There was this trend, 20 years ago, and I'm 40 now, there was this trend of people kind of really going plant-based and becoming, especially there was like this raw food movement, right? And you saw a lot of people, especially women, that were like, fasting is not only something that's super important spiritually for your spiritual development, but that's actually one of the ways to detoxify your body. So you would see people regularly go on, 2 days, 3 days with just water or maybe a little bit of tea here and there. And a lot of people were suffering during that time. The people that weren't were typically the people that were the healthiest already and had good reserves and like had a good balanced diet and a lot of different things, were eating enough protein sources, especially in some instances like animal protein. But can heavy fasting for women in that age group be something detrimental for their health?
100%. And I am the most protective of women that are at peak childbearing age. So even if they're not in a position where they want to become pregnant, our bodies are acutely attuned to food and famine and perceived famine, even if it's just a period of fasting. And unfortunately, we live in a culture that if a little bit is good, more is better. And so when I see young women who are thin and lean, and maybe they do CrossFit, maybe they do marathons, maybe they're doing Ironmans. I mean, so people that are an intense degree of exercise and effort, understanding that their body is going to take that perceived stress much more significantly than a man or a menopausal woman. And so I'm a little bit hesitant to recommend a lot of fasting for lean young women. I think 12 hours of digestive rest is reasonable. It's very different if I have an obese 23-year-old patient with polycystic ovarian syndrome who very likely would improve her insulin resistance by practicing some degree of fasting optimized for the menstrual cycle. But I think in a lot of other instances, the more is more mindset is really toxic. And if you're already lean, these incremental shifts that you might get when you start doing longer fasts, I think can be potentially harmful. I know that Ted Naiman talks about this quite a bit, about, the degree of over 24 hours, if you're already lean, are you really getting a lot of benefit? And so I've taken that to heart, largely because I think on a lot of levels that a little bit of fasting is good. Fasting optimized for your menstrual cycle is important, but also understanding that you don't need to have this hormesis, this hormetic stress all the time. Maybe you fast one day a week. that might be plenty. If you're already lean, if you're obese, overweight, you're metabolically unhealthy, you could probably get by with lower carbohydrate, more periods of digestive rest. But this thought process of doing, 5 to 7 day fast when you're a 110-pound woman and you lose your menstrual cycle. And I think the menstrual cycle really should be a sixth vital sign. It should be a barometer with which we utilize, is this too much stress for this woman's body? Now, do I have women that are at peak fertile years who maybe their first or second menstrual cycle after they start fasting is a little wonky, maybe heavier, lighter, but it shouldn't go away. If you lose your menstrual cycle and you're not pregnant, that is definitely a sign that your body perceives you would not be able to, your body's not in an optimal position to be able to fertilize an egg and potentially have a baby and be pregnant. So I'm very protective of those women. And I think there's actually, good research about the uber elite athletes that are females and why they should not be fasting. And I think about people like Stacy Sims, who is anti-fasting, but does a lot of research about women and their menstrual cycles and optimizing the degree of, the degree of intensity of their exercise optimized for their menstrual cycle. And I think she brings up some good points. I do think, on the other hand, when we're looking at perimenopausal women, so women that are 10 to 15 years preceding menopause, the game changes. So yes, in your 20s and 30s, you can get away with a lot. The game changes, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but all of a sudden we become a little less stress resilient, especially as our ovaries are producing less progesterone. So this may be when women start seeing menstrual irregularities. They may have heavier cycles. Their sleep may not be optimized anymore. They may have more anxiety and depression. Sometimes what they're given are antidepressants, and what they probably need is a little bit of progesterone, but they become less stress resilient. So, perimenopause and menopause, these women have to focus on sleep, which is foundational. They have to lean into stress management. That's not 5 minutes of meditation once a week. They need to eat anti-inflammatory nutrition. And for a lot of people, they want to eat like they're 18. But you can't. I mean, you really can't if you want to be optimized. They have to examine their relationship with alcohol and processed carbs. And the other piece of that is they have to examine their relationship with exercise. I'm a fan of everyone exercising, but all of a sudden, again, the game changes. So you start to, in your early 40s, it's not a question of if, but when. You will start losing some degree of muscle mass. You'll also lose muscle strength. I always say sarcopenia is going to happen, but you want to do everything you can to help offset that, because as you're losing muscle, you become less insulin sensitive. You become at greater risk for developing metabolic diseases. And so this is really the time for women to understand more protein, less carbohydrates. That doesn't mean none, right types of fats. Leaning into all those things can really help with the success for whether or not they're going to do well. And I would lastly say that irrespective of life stage, if you're still getting a menstrual cycle, understanding there's a time in your menstrual cycle to fast and a time that you should not. And that's something that I think is woefully not discussed enough. Women are not many men, and we shouldn't feel like we have to apologize for our physiology. We should actually embrace it and not feel bad or guilty or any of those things. Just understand our bodies are so delicate in terms of our hormonal physiology, how the hormones change. Our sex hormones change week to week, day to day throughout our cycle until women go into menopause. And so I think that really makes a great deal of sense. I always say perimenopause buffers these two time periods, but I do find many women can do really well with fasting in perimenopause and menopause, but I'm very conservative with younger women because I want to protect their fertility. And frankly, the degree of hormesis that many women want to, like I said, if a little bit of fasting is good, they want to do a lot more, could potentially, set them up for having some fertility problems later in their lives. And I certainly don't want that for them.
Yeah, it's all part of the evolution of wellness, where things are more personalized, there's more context, there's more nuance, and then you can still get the benefits from it. We don't want to fully make our entire life about some modality, because that modality is just one thing. And at the same time, we don't want to fully write off something because of the benefits that are there, that are clearly present and available to people. And that's the, wellness in a way is growing up. It's getting more sophisticated, like everything, right? Politics is, this is that. There's a brighter side within all of this People talk about our world being more polarized than ever in every category, diet, fitness, politics, this. I think the silver lining that many people are missing is that there's voices that are coming to the surface that are saying, hey guys, like, here's a little bit about how you kind of both see the sides, right? And here's also where you might be a little bit wrong. And let's like have an honest human to human conversation about how we can take advantage of the things that work well, leave the things that don't, and then also personalize it in context. And I really see your work doing that for especially women, but obviously it's attributable to men too, when it comes to the topic of fasting. So thank you for that. Thank you for being a voice of reason in this world that either wants to fully embrace things or wants to completely write them off. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. No, I like existing in the gray. And I have a child who's everything is very black and white in his world. And I have to remind him, I think many years of clinical experience and just life experience, I realize we're missing opportunities to connect with people if we don't acknowledge our bio-individuality. We don't acknowledge where we are in time and space. And so thank you for acknowledging that. It's really gratifying to be in a position where I can help educate people about their bodies and strategies that can be embraced and be used successfully.
Absolutely. Well, I got a bunch more questions. I'd love to keep on going if you have the time. That was just a little break to acknowledge you because I really do appreciate people who live in the gray and help people navigate it. So I want to come back to your story because I think it's a very powerful lesson, not just on fasting, but it's also a powerful lesson about rebuilding your life and stepping into your purpose. And I think that, at the end of the day, the question for a lot of people is, sure, yes, why do you want to be healthy? Okay, you might want to lose a little weight. You might want to get more fit. You might want to, be around to run around and play with your, grandkids or whatever it might be. But regardless of the vanity sort of metrics that are there, you really want to step into your best self when I talk to most people because you want to give love and attention to everything in your life that matters and you want to show up fully. If I understand from your story correctly, you had this idea around wanting to give a talk, right? You wanted to give a talk, but you ended up in the hospital for an issue with your appendix. Is that right? Am I setting up the context of the story correctly? Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes. Yeah. To give the audience context, in 2018, I'm an introvert. I think people are surprised to hear that. And I decided that a big, scary goal would be to give a TED Talk. I don't know why. It just seemed to be the thing. I want to give a TED Talk for no other reason other than it's a fun challenge. And so in 2018, I sent out a lot of applications. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot, which is why I always tell people persistence absolutely wins. And so I was offered
over
my first
80 applications. I think you had mentioned.
You've done your homework. Yes. And that's why I tell people, I'm like, listen, I sent a lot out and, I got 3 offers. So I was offered my first talk and my first talk was on perimenopause, the super sexy topic of perimenopause. And around the same time, I was offered a second in the state I was born in, which is South Carolina. And I kept saying, I'm going to take this as a sign. I was very close to my grandmother and I love South Carolina because I saw it through her eyes. And so I committed to a second talk and they asked me to do a female slanted talk. And so we'd already agreed upon the topic was intermittent fasting. And literally it was a decision. I looked at my husband, what do I know a lot about? And he said, intermittent fasting. I said, okay, I'm going to talk about intermittent fasting. And then they said, will you please give a female slanted talk? Because we get a lot of requests. And so I said, sure. And the irony is I had gone on my husband's business trip with him for the first time ever. And I came back from this business trip and I thought I had food poisoning because I tend to be one of those people. I always say like, it's very Darwinian. I'm going to be the person that's going to get food poisoning. But it turned out I didn't have food poisoning. And after a day of feeling crummy, I, said to my husband, I think we need to go to the ER. And to make a very long story short, I spent 13 days in the hospital with lots of complications related to a ruptured appendix. And the irony is I had been an ER nurse in my past life. And I said to my husband as we were driving to the hospital, I said, the pain I'm having is worse than labor pain, which was a clue that I was sick. And I said, if they don't figure out what's going on with me, I'm going to die. And I said that to him and, he's not a medical person. So he heard that and took that to heart. But I had so many complications. Initially when the surgeon came in and said, you've got a ruptured appendix and the entire length of your colon's inflamed. If I take you to surgery tonight, I'm going to take your colon. I said, oh no one's taking my colon. As sick as I was like, no one's taking my colon. She said, we can take your colon. You'll be fine. I said, no one's taking my colon. I said, please, please, please give me time so that you don't have to do that large of a surgery. And so I had multiple complications. I had small bowel obstruction. I developed retroperitoneal abscesses. I developed a fistula. And after 13 days, after losing 15 pounds, I went home. And during that hospitalization, you really understand as a clinician, you get to a point where I was very despondent. I've never been clinically depressed in my life. But as you can imagine, as I'm realizing how sick I am, and I've got a surgeon coming in saying, we don't know why you're not getting better, I started getting very depressed. But I was very committed to getting home to my children. And I kept saying, I'm going to do this talk. And my husband was like, you're nuts. There's no way. You're going to go home. You need to convalesce. And sure enough, I went home. My Italian mom was there to force feed me food. And I said to the TEDx organizers, I really want to give this talk. And they kept saying, well, we don't want you to compromise your recovery. And I said, no, my surgeon said, if I'm hitting all my milestones, I can still do this talk. And so the only intention I set when I did this second talk was to show my kids I was okay, because it was so important to me. And the irony is I did that talk with a ruptured appendix because I was too sick to do surgery, but I was okay enough to go and do this talk. And 10 days later, I had my appendix out. And I told my kids that we were going to have this really low key summer. And it turned out that was not the case, because that talk went viral really quickly and changed my life forever. And I always like to tell people that through adversity comes opportunity. That was my biggest takeaway, was something not so ideal can happen in your personal life and you can turn it around. And I feel so very grateful that I was able to give that talk. Obviously, it's changed our lives. But now I get to do exactly what I've always wanted to do, which is to be able to reach more people and share a message that can be encouraging and hopeful and positive and impactful.
No, it's a beautiful story. And it's not only a story of redemption and stepping into your purpose, but it's also a reminder for anybody who's here, regardless of what you're going through in your life, no matter how bad you feel your health is, regardless of how many things are going on with your job or your relationship or other stuff, if you lean into it and you have the will, there's a way out. There's a way forward. But we need to find that inspiration, and we need to find that why and tap into that why to say, why do I want to do it? I can imagine in your instance, it's kind of like you saw a possibility of you potentially not being around and definitely potentially not having your health. And it's like, I need to go out and do the thing that I've been wanting to do. Like, there's no excuses. Sure, it's going to be tough, but I'm just going to make it happen. And that's an important reminder to people. And it's actually one of the reminders that my deepest hope is that people don't get faced with that. I had a friend previously that would call that like an eviction notice sometimes, right? You'd get an eviction notice from your body saying like, hey man, you have heart disease, or you have this, or you have that going on. My hope is that people don't have to get there, although that place is very motivating. And that's one of the reasons that we want to prioritize health now, is so that, knock on wood, we can choose our hard instead of a health issue, which sometimes just happens to us. We can't control it. Maybe it's something else that we want to get a chance to lean into. So I really appreciate you sharing your story, because I do think it's going to resonate in the context of what we're talking about today.
Yeah. And it's interesting because someone asked me recently, did you get really sick because you had been fasting? And I said, no, actually, my surgeon, I cried in her office. I'm not a particularly emotional person, but I was so grateful that she had been my surgeon, because she gave me the time to be able to save my colon and not take that out as well. And she said, if you had been any other 47-year-old, you would have had a different outcome. And it's like, I still get chills when I think about what she said, because I knew how sick I was. I'd taken care of very sick patients, working in cardiology, we're in the ER, the ICU, I'm doing all sorts of dealing with highly acutely sick people. And for me, I was just so grateful. I was like, I'm so grateful I was so healthy, because I at least had a good fighting chance that I was going to get out of the hospital and still do really well. And it's interesting. I have never been able to sit and watch that talk. I watch clips, but I can't watch the talk. It's too painful, because my brain had not caught up with how sick I had been, because I'd only been out of the hospital for 27 days. It was such a short interval of time where I was really trying to heal, to get strong enough. And I hadn't even prepared anything for that talk. And somehow, this is where I think the universe, gives you a kick in the ass, and it encourages you to either you're going to swim or you're going to drown. And I just wasn't willing. I'm too tenacious. I'm too stubborn. I was like, there was no way I was not going to do that talk, because I felt so strongly that it was important to show to my kids that I wasn't nearly as sick as I had been. I wanted them to have hope and to know that their mom was okay. That was really the intention I set, that I didn't think anything beyond that.
You know, and you were saying that somebody asked you recently, like, did you end up in the hospital because you were fasting too much? And you were like, no, that was part of my healing journey. And in fact, you know, I read an article many years ago about, like, you know, for the longest time in modern medicine, we didn't really understand, well, what is the purpose of an appendix, right? And there was an article that came out in Scientific America a few years ago, and it was reshared in a bunch of places. And it's like, we think that the appendix actually plays an overflow area as storage for like emergency gut microbiome bacteria, you know, and it's a big part of that process. It's not essential in the sense that many people have to have their appendix removed, but there does to be like, it's like a stopgap measure. At least that was one of the thinking that was there. And just hearing about your story and how you were being treated for Lyme, right? And at the time, doctors were doing the best they could, but it included heavy usage of antibiotics. Mm-hmm. And that led to and contributed to some of the incidences of these autoimmune conditions that developed later on. And then fasting was a big part of what helped you repair that, in addition to cleaning up your diet and lifestyle. In a way, you could argue that if you hadn't fasted all that time previously, if you hadn't repaired your gut, it might have ended up in a worse situation than what happened to you.
No, and the irony is, the arrogance that I had years ago. We used to talk about vestigial organs that have no purpose. And when I was in my training, despite being at a top research institution, we thought of the appendix as this vestigial organ that had no value. It didn't do anything for the body. And back in the 1990s, that's probably what everyone thought. The irony is, I've later learned that I had picked up food poisoning in Morocco about 6 months before I got sick. And the now working hypothesis is the food poisoning that I got in Morocco probably set the stage for the changes that were occurring in the gut microbiome that contributed to the ruptured appendix. And so, I think our bodies can be our best teachers. To me, having to surrender, as a clinician, I had to turn my brain off and stop trying to think my way through all of that. And now I just sit back and say, okay, I have a healthy amount of respect for the appendix that was removed in April of 2019, but I'm grateful for the journey. But how many of us don't realize that all these things, you can connect the dots retrospectively, but at the time you're not making those connections.
Well, one of those areas that there is a deeper connection, and we've talked about our mutual friend who was on the podcast previously, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, and you're doing a lot of this work too, is that often people would be weighing out the benefits and the cost of fasting, both men and women, and integrating into their life. So the thought was that if you're regularly going to be tapping into the power of fasting, that also means that you need to sacrifice other things. And one of the things that people were sacrificing, again, this was happening both to men and women, was dietary protein and its relationship with muscle mass. Now, we talked a little bit about that in the beginning, but tell us about why you're so passionate about making sure that people understand this message and how important keeping our muscles intact and strong as we age is to our overall health.
Yeah, it's an area that I'm incredibly passionate about, largely because I understood such a little amount of how critically important it is to maintain muscle mass throughout our age. Most of us have the bulk of our bone and muscle mass in our 20s and 30s. And what starts to happen after 40 is that we will lose muscle. And this is called sarcopenia. It's a muscle loss with aging is not a question of if, but when. And the degree of muscle loss can be mitigated by many things. Part of that is adequate protein intake, which is more than most Americans are consuming. Muscle protein synthesis that is mitigated by lifting heavy things. And if you're not already lifting, even body weight exercise is going to be better than being the chronic cardio person. And then getting adequate amounts of sleep, not to mention the fact, depending on where you are in life stage, hormone replacement therapy can be very beneficial for helping to maintain muscle mass. And what many people don't realize is that we have estrogen and testosterone receptors in our muscles. It's not just we have these isolated hormones that don't have a direct net impact on nearly every organ in the body. And so I find that when I do diet recalls with patients and I'm talking to them about their food intake, most women are probably consuming 40 to 50 grams of protein a day, which is woefully inadequate. I think a bare minimum when I'm working with people is to kind of think of it as 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. So I weigh 120 pounds and I aim for no less than 100 grams of protein a day. And ironically enough, I was telling my husband I didn't think he was consuming enough protein. So he started tracking just for a week to get a sense of how much protein he was consuming. And he himself was not eating enough protein. So most of us, even if we're healthy eaters, if we're not pushing that, the 40, 50 grams of protein in a meal, you can be under eating all the time. And really understanding the value of having adequate amount of protein and how that impacts muscle protein synthesis and muscle mass is important. I think on a lot of levels, people think, oh, if I just eat enough protein, that's enough. Nope. You got to add in the heavy loads. You have to, be slowly and progressively increasing the amount of weight that you're lifting. It's not enough to just do chronic cardio and then the high quality sleep, which helps with restoration of these processes. But I think it's also important to kind of talk about why I'm a fan of at least 2 boluses of food in a feeding window, because you can't hit those protein thresholds in one meal. I don't know anyone that can eat 150 grams of protein in a meal. Maybe there is a unicorn out there, but I'm not aware of any of them. But I find most people do better with 2 boluses of food. And that makes it sound like we're not enjoying the food. We are enjoying the food, but eating 2 large portions of protein along with non-starchy vegetables and healthy fats per day minimum. That's why I'm not a fan of sustained OMAD or 1 meal a day, but also understanding that sometimes people on top of doing all of those things, high quality sleep, adequate protein intake and lifting weights, sometimes people also need some degree of testosterone replacement. And even for women, even in menopause or in perimenopause. But it's important to also note that the number one reason why men don't have enough circulating free testosterone is related to insulin resistance, of which only 7 to 8% of the population is metabolically healthy, but also our exposure to endocrine mimicking chemicals. So it's important to kind of lean into the things that can contribute to some degree of hormonal dysregulation in the body. So those are the things I really like. That's the meat, literally, of what I like to focus on to help people understand that muscle is an organ of longevity. Muscle is what helps with insulin sensitivity. Muscle is a glucose reservoir. That's why I encourage people to walk after meals and to lift their weights and to get enough protein in. All those things are very important because you don't want to be in a position. I had many patients over the years that could not get off of a toilet. They were in the hospital and they didn't have the strength in their legs to get off of a toilet. So we call them activities of daily living, things that are just normal stuff, getting out of bed, getting off the toilet. Being able to do those things throughout your lifetime is very important because you don't want to become frail and you don't want to lose so much strength and muscle mass that you are no longer able to care for yourself. And I think that's a really important focus. Maybe someone in their 20s and 30s aren't even thinking about that. I know my teenagers think my husband and I are super old and we couldn't possibly understand all the things that they're going through. Little do they know we've been that age before, so we do know. But also important for people, 40s, 50s, and 60s to understand it's critically important for metabolic health, for insulin sensitivity, just for functional activity day to day to remain active and to do all these things, to incorporate these things into our lifestyle so that we can continue to live, not just survive, but thrive, whatever life stage we're in.
Well said. You mentioned you recently turned 50. I think you said last year was a big birthday year for you. And
it was.
And talk to us about, for you, especially somebody who, if I'm hearing correctly, was active previously, but strength training in whatever capacity that you do it now wasn't really part of the routine, right? It wasn't, maybe, if I understand that correctly, and then you prioritized it and made it a part of the routine as you started to understand more how crucial it was. So how does that show up for you now in terms of protocol and cadence in your life? Something that might give our listeners inspiration of how they could, whether they're 40, 30, 20, 60, 70, 80, there's no wrong time to start incorporating into your life. So it might give them some inspiration of how they can do it for themselves.
Yeah, it's a great question. I have always been physically active. I lifted weights, probably not heavy enough, and I probably did a way more cardio. I was one of those people that was still doing really intense strength and conditioning classes in my early 40s, which, remember what I said earlier, hormesis, right amount of stress at the right time and I was probably overdoing it. So I think for me, the last 3 to 4 years have really been focused on strength training. Like I prioritize that over everything else. I don't lift more than 2 to 3 days a week because it's trying to figure out too many things on the calendar. I love Pilates. I do Pilates once or twice a week, and I walk a lot. I have 2 dogs. We live in a beautiful neighborhood that, lots of trees and lots of beautiful skies. And so connection with nature. I get anywhere from 10 to 15,000 steps a day, and that's a priority. And I really do enjoy walking with my husband in the morning with our dogs. We both work from home. Same thing in the evening. And then I think on a lot of different levels, my physical activity metrics, I've become more focused, more conscientious about consistency. I think when I was younger, I probably didn't really think much about what things were going to be like when I got older. And now that I'm in that stage and I have the privilege of being able to work with so many people of different age groups, the people that do the best as they are getting older are the ones that are leaning into things that kind of support the autonomic nervous system. So parasympathetic nervous system, rest and repose. So whether it's meditation, I have an aura ring. I'm kind of a gadget person, admittedly. I have all these things that help me kind of stay centered. I now have it looks like a bean. It's called Somnox. It's actually something that you sleep with, and I only set mine for about 30 minutes, but it actually adapts to your breathing cycle, and it's actually supporting the autonomic nervous system. And then it turns off, and then I push it out of bed. But that has actually doubled my deep sleep. And for me, like sleep is an art form. So really leaning into that parasympathetic, very firm boundaries. I have never been more clear about the people I want in my life and the people that bring me joy and the people that I enjoy being around. And I really lean into that. I think that's super important. But I would say without question, the biggest changes I've made over the last few years have been more protein, tracking macros occasionally, looking at CGM data. So looking at the continuous glucose monitor to see what impacts some of the dietary choices that I make. And then the protein piece, which, now it isn't such a big deal, but I remember in the beginning, it seemed very overwhelming to largely double, the amount of protein that I was consuming. But now it allows for a degree of satiety that I can comfortably step away from the table. I'm not tempted by, I've never been much of a sweets eater, but I do enjoy dark chocolate. But has allowed me and has afforded me the opportunity to really have my metabolic health optimized, and that I'm really grateful about. But for anyone that's listening, and sometimes it's just taking one change. I didn't do all these things at once, but one change can have a really large net impact. And pick one thing at a time. Don't feel like you have to change everything. That's overwhelming, and that definitely sometimes leads to a degree of this all or nothing. I'm either all in or I'm all out. And so I always say focus on one thing at a time, whether it's you're going to decide to fast or you decide to lift consistently, or maybe you decide to track your food just to see where your macros are and make adjustments from there.
On that idea of giving people that first step, you kind of mentioned a few, but let's contextualize them and say maybe who would be a good fit for that. So I've heard you previously share that sometimes the first step for someone, and again, people are listening, they're going to have to personalize this for where they're at. Sometimes the first step is just not snacking, right? Mm-hmm. And just going now to meals, which kind of is like balanced with making sure that those meals that they have are a better balance from a glucose standpoint, from a protein standpoint, and are like truly satiating. So who have you seen? If you would have like an archetype, I don't know, this is a game that I'm playing. This may not even work out, but if there was a patient typically that would come to see you in the past who would do well with that as a first step, who would that be comparatively to, let's go to a few other things, like somebody who maybe their first step is just walking after meals, or somebody who actually needs to focus on, maybe sleep is a first step, right? And I have like maybe one or two more that I'll run through. So it's not going to be an exact science, but just it's nice for people to understand like who might be thinking about that as the first step. So let's start off with the first one of, not snacking and focusing on the meals as like literally the next step that they do. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I think a great deal of my success with my patients and clients is getting a sense of where they are. How ready are they to change? So the person that's going from a standard American diet and is physically inactive, rip the Band-Aid off and get them to stop snacking is like the first step. And that's typically someone who is pre-diabetic, overweight, probably middle-aged. So it might be perimenopause or menopausal. They've tried all the things. They have a lot of cravings. They're not sleeping well. So stopping snacking. And the way that I do that is I encourage them to understand if we can get your macros, your protein, fat, and carbs optimized, you're not going to need to snack. And so having that faith and convincing them that we're going to do this in a way that you're not going to have cravings and you're not going to be hungry in between meals, because that's oftentimes a fear. They don't want to get hungry. They fear that hunger represents they've done something wrong. And many of those people have, again, I kind of alluded to this in the beginning, they have perhaps an unhealthy relationship with food. So food is comfort. And so trying to kind of get them to understand, we're going to get you to have enough protein and the right types of carbs and the healthy fats, so you're not going to be hungry. So those are the people that once they start having the benefit of not being hungry in between their meals, they are then in a position where they're like, okay, I made it from breakfast to lunch and from lunch to dinner. Now I need to work on after dinner, because a lot of these people are eating in the evening. They're having alcohol, they're having sweets, they're having a lot of processed carbs, which we all know that those are the types of carbohydrates that are going to trick our brains into thinking we're not full and that we need more of them. You know, that dopamine hit can be so impactful. So that's the person that I would probably lean into stopping the snacking. Now, the people who just need to walk, that's someone who we're really starting from the basics. If they're really fearful to do anything, I'm like, if you do nothing else, walk after your lunch and your dinner. If you do nothing else, walk for 10 to 15 minutes. And it's those small wins. You know, once they get that small win and they can monitor, I'm like, okay, let's get a glucometer or get a continuous glucose monitor, depending on what's in your budget. Let's monitor your response. And they walk and their blood sugar is 125. And then after their walk, it's 80 or it's 90. And they're like, wow, that's really powerful. And so we do that for a period of time. But I think a lot of my job is determining the readiness for change. You know, 1,000 years ago when I did my graduate level thesis, we talked about the trans-theoretical model of change and the readiness for change. And so a lot of what I do is determine who is the person, how are they best served? Because I can tell them all the things, but if they're overwhelmed, they're not going to make any decisions. So let's just give them one tangible area for them to focus on at a time. And then as they win that, then we move on to something else. And so the walkers are going to be after meal, are going to be the people that are really just overwhelmed with everything. And I'm like, okay, let's just do one thing and monitor your blood sugar response. And then they're very interested. Then they're very vested. Like, okay, what can we do next? And so it's just adding pieces. It's like peeling an onion, peel another layer back. Okay, what do we do next? And then they generally get so excited because they feel like they're in control of something that they're willing to add in another intervention.
I've also heard you say that sometimes it's even maybe just taking an honest look at the relationship in your life, right? Especially if somebody's married, has a partner, because sometimes the inability to make progress, or the feeling that a lot of people feel that they're self-sabotaging, is actually because they don't feel that they're in a loving relationship, or that they're with somebody who is bringing what, Dr. John Gottman and the work of the Gottman Institute calls like the four henchmen of the apocalypse, somebody who's constantly criticizing them, belligerizing them, putting them down. And not that there's an easy solution around it, but if you see that that's an area of your life that needs attention, sometimes handling that makes then everything else a lot more easier to do. So it's not always just about health and sleep and fasting. It's about these other nutrients. And one of those nutrients could be the relationship.
Well, and I think adequate social support is probably not discussed often enough, that we don't talk to one another about how important it is, whether it's a family or friends, but having someone that's a support for your change, whether it's your spouse, significant other, your best friend, your brother, your sister, your family members. We all need support when we're making changes. If someone is constantly telling us or belittling us or they themselves are uncomfortable with us making changes because it's shining a mirror on their own choices that they're making. Sometimes when people are triggered by the fact, I'll give you an example, triggered by the fact that I fast, I have to oftentimes just give them grace and look at them compassionately and realize this is not about me. This is a reflection of for them. They're triggered. It's bringing up their stuff. Maybe it's something they need to work on. But I always say, listen, it has to be what works best for you. And if you're not comfortable with fasting, that's totally fine. This is what works for me and works really well for my lifestyle. But I think having the ability to be able to make decisions and have someone that's supportive of your decisions is really critical and can make a big difference for most people when they're making, because it's scary, when you're making those kinds of lifestyle changes, it can be overwhelming and scary, especially if some of these habits you've had since you were 18. That's always when I used to talk to male patients in the office, and I would say, well, what were things like when you were 18? A lot of men focus in on what they were like at 18. And I'm like, okay, well, we can't eat like when we were 18. So like, that's number one. And then number two, like, what are you doing differently at 54 versus 18? And they're like, oh, I played 3 sports and I was always active. Or like, okay, so, we need to like lean into, you keep thinking that you can eat like you're 18, but you're actually not. So I agree with you wholeheartedly that having support in some capacity or another is absolutely critical.
Cynthia, as we're winding down here in the interview, just want to hit on a few things kind of top level. I promised people that we would come back to the topic of alcohol. So I have a few subjects like that I'd just love to tee up for you and get your commentary on. So you mentioned that during the pandemic, you stopped drinking. You never had a problem. You never were a big drinker. How do you talk about and teach about alcohol, especially on social media, which, by the way, I love your social media account. You are very, I think the British would call it like cheeky. You're fun. You sort of bring, you're not shy of leaning into a little bit of like the controversial topics, but you do it in a fun way and you're not negative about it. So just want to give you hats off for that. It's like a fun way for people to learn. So yeah, alcohol. What do you want to say about it?
Well, thank you for that. I can be a little snarky, sometimes more so on Twitter, but it's never at anyone's expense. And I appreciate that you acknowledge that. Alcohol is a tough topic, because it can be very polarizing, and obviously there are people on different journeys. And I do think for a lot of women, alcohol in particular becomes a huge issue. There's a lot of a mommy drinking culture. I certainly saw quite a bit of that in the former city I lived in. And I think for a lot of people, what works for us in our 20s and 30s stops working quite as well. We know alcohol is processed as a toxin in the body. We know that it dysregulates sleep quality, so it can erode REM and deep sleep. We know that it can impact our estrogen levels in our body, and it isn't so much the estrogen, the estradiol that we're endogenously making, but the exposure to estrogen mimicking chemicals. It can actually make things worse there. There's some research to suggest that it can be a risk factor. The degree of alcohol consumption can be a risk factor for certain types of cancers, including breast cancer. And so I think we each one of us have to identify what is our relationship with alcohol, and is it a healthy one? What are our coping mechanisms, and is alcohol part of our coping mechanism? And so there's never any judgment. I just like to use it as an educational tool. But for myself personally, the only thing that gave me hot flashes was when I drank alcohol. And I don't like hot flashes, and my blood sugar is really well supported, well stabilized. But I was starting to make the connection that alcohol plus sleep was a no-go. And sleep for me, if anyone that knows me knows, it's pretty important. So I think that it's almost always part of the discussion with women to help them understand that, alcohol is not benign. We know it's a neurotoxin. And I think that every individual has to decide for themselves, if they choose to drink, how much, the quantity, et cetera. I think quality is important. So biodynamic wines are going to be better than conventional wines. And unfortunately, I have now gone down the rabbit hole of understanding the wine industry and how that can impact the quality of the product that comes out. So I think for every person out there, it's determining, what is my relationship? Is it a healthy one? And does it serve me? And I think that's really what it comes down to.
Yeah. What's exciting is I've never seen more people talking about getting off alcohol, especially people who have, no challenges with it in the traditional sense of an addiction or sobriety issues or other stuff. And I've just been seeing across the landscape of all my friends and family, everybody's cutting back and many people are cutting out completely. And even though that might be a little weird in some circles, I've never seen it more acceptable. And I love all the conversations around that. Okay, great. Thank you for your thoughts on that. Another thing that I want to tee up, how do you feel about some of the complementary therapeutics or modalities that are out there? For instance, like sauna, right? Sauna and red light. Any hot takes on those?
Oh, I love all the complementary modalities. I'm a big fan of cryotherapy and infrared sauna, acupuncture. I mean, any of those modalities that allow us to feel more centered and grounded. I'm a total tech geek, so I'm the person that's got all the gadgets. In fact, I have a new Oura ring sitting on my desk that I have to kind of queue up. But with that being said, I think it depends on your budget. And a lot of these things that we're talking about, in particular, infrared sauna, red light therapies, cryotherapies, cold water exposure, cold plunges, high intensity interval training, all these things are a form of hormesis, much like fasting. And so to me, it's just different ways to challenge the body. And I think, comfort is a cage. I'm a huge fan of, you can't be comfortable. We have to be pushing our bodies in some capacity. And so I hate the cold, which means I have to do cryotherapy. I love the heat. So being in a sauna or doing red light therapy, I love. It's what I lean into. But I always say the only way that I challenge my body is by making myself cold. That's a big challenge for me. And so I love them. I think they're helpful for mitochondrial biogenesis. They make people, and many times they help release endorphins. They feel good. And so I do encourage people to not stay comfortable, to, move the lever just enough so that you're pushing your body, but not so that you're exhausted and depleted.
This kind of relates to our conversation previously and some of the nuances that are there. We had a guest on the podcast before, Dr. Jay Wiles, who has a company that works in the space of heart rate variability. And one of the things that he was seeing, because he works with a lot of athletes, is that because cold therapy is a hormesis, again, it's that balancing act, just like a lot of fasting could be maybe challenging for women in their fertility years. He found the same thing with cold exposure, that if some of his top athletes were doing cold exposure, specifically women, more than twice a week, sometimes that had detrimental effects on like heart rate variability, which is a sign of increased, more stress than what the body can be capable of managing in that period. So I love the way that you kind of talk about it, which is these are all tools in the toolbox, and we're trying to look at them in relationship to each other. And obviously, again, that's specific for people at that age. When you are at a different stage in your life, there's other things that can work for you then.
Absolutely. And I think it's important for people, again, to do some degree of experimentation, to lean into what they like. I actually got my engineer husband doing cryotherapy, which I think is hilarious. And now he gets excited about it. But it's, find a partner or significant other or friend that wants to do some of these things with you and try things out, lean into what feels good. Like I said, for me, my constant thing that I have to work on is the fact I don't like the cold, which tells me I just need to do it. And so whether it's 15 seconds at the end of a shower, which I suffer through because it's good for me, or going to cryotherapy once a week, I think all those things allow me to be a stronger, more resilient human being.
Yeah. And it's great to see more of them popping up right across the street from us here in Los Angeles. There's a cryotherapy place. I went there this morning with one of my buddies. It was fantastic.
Awesome.
You've mentioned multiple times in the interview about the power that hormone replacement therapy could offer some women. I think that for a lot of people who are aware of it, but are trying to find the right practitioner, right, for them, any thoughts or recommendations on, like, if somebody's looking for the right person, any kind of online communities or places or ways to investigate to find the right practitioner that can help them through that process?
Yeah, I think referrals are really important. I tend to be probably much like you are. I tend to be very conscientious about the individuals I bring on my podcast. And so a lot of the practitioners I brought on the podcast do telemedicine and do use HRT with their patients. So I think referrals are very important, because you could get on a website and look for a general practitioner. Even for myself, I find it has been quite a journey to find the right provider to help me with those decisions. Many of whom are still practicing with the byproduct of the Women's Health Initiative from 2002. There's a whole generation of clinicians and a whole generation of women who are fearful of hormones, fearful to prescribe them if they're a clinician, fearful to take them if they're of an appropriate age. So I think referrals are really important. I think being very clear about what you want. And I tell women all the time, it's almost like a la carte. You don't have to per se, you don't have to per se do synthetic. I generally recommend bioidenticals. Even though there's no FDA approved testosterone, you can get compounded testosterone as a female, and that can make a big difference for many women. You can have oral therapies, troches, patches. I mean, there's so many options, but I think it's really important to make sure you're working with a clinician who is going to honor your own feelings and honor and acknowledge them, because I have worked with a few people, even though I'm not far into this process. I've worked with a few that completely negated everything that I knew, and that was a problem. So I think definitely referrals can be helpful, and just being very honest about what you would like. Ultimately, what is important to you? What are your goals?
Beautiful. Cynthia, this has been fantastic. I'd love to give an opportunity for you to share a little about your world. We mentioned the book previously, and for those that are watching again, it's right behind you. You can see it. For those that are listening, it's Intermittent Fasting Transformation. And it's the 45-day program for women to lose stubborn weight, improve hormonal health, and slow aging. Pick up a copy. We have the link inside of the show notes. What else is part of your world that you've built together? You've mentioned the coaches that are part of it. Can people work with these coaches that are there?
Yes, they can. So we have a program called the IF45 program, and I have coaches that have been certified in my program. So they're out practicing, doing amazing work, many of whom are clinicians. I've got a podcast called Everyday Wellness, and I co-host another podcast called the Intermittent Fasting Podcast. And I'm pretty active on social media. I think, I really stepped away from direct patient care, because I oversee group programs. But what I really love to do is to connect with other communities and to be able to encourage people to live, more fulfilling, happy lives, utilizing strategies that are science-based, and certainly, strategies that people can integrate at any stage of their lives and do so successfully.
Any final words of wisdom that you want to leave the person who feels like, you know what, I'm so beat up from falling off the bandwagon. That's a common phrase that a lot of people use, from getting on and falling off. And I've tried so many different things, and I'm just like, I'm so tired through that whole process that's there. But I'm hearing this information. Again, going back to our first question, I'm hearing this information about fasting. I've read a little bit about it. I've seen people that it's worked for. I'm just not sure if it works for me. Any final words of wisdom you want to leave that person with?
Yeah, no, I know the journey can be arduous and overwhelming, and have faith that there are lots of different ways to learn about lifestyle strategies, whether it's reading a book, listening to a podcast to be inspired, but it's one step forward. We don't have to make all the changes all at once, but sometimes one step forward can be a catalyst to a whole different lifestyle. And I think being really clear about what your goals are. I think for a lot of people, they want to make changes, but they don't know how to envision or manifest those changes. So I think being very clear, even if it's writing it out on paper, being very clear about the type of life you'd like to lead and how to get you from point A to point B. But the other thing I would say is, working with a clinician or a coach that can help you make sure that the steps you're taking are heading you in the right direction for the goals that you'd like to attain.
I'm so thankful that out of a big rock bottom moment in your life, you use it as inspiration to put your message out there. I think there's a lot of people that are sitting on a message today in just whatever way, and it may not be a TED Talk. It could be volunteering more at their kids' school. It could be, giving back to people. It could be starting a business. It could be writing a book. You're sitting on a message and you want to do it. And your story is an example of go for it, because you had a talk that went viral and now we all benefit from your work that's out there. So Cynthia, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and really stepping into your mission and being an example for our community.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been an honor and a privilege.
Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
My simple strategy is control carbohydrates, prioritize protein, don't fear fat. Really, those three, if someone adheres to those, it makes, at least for me, it's been reasonably effortless.